a simple insult changed everything. When my brother called me weak, he had no idea he was starting a journey that would transform me completely. This is the story of silence, patience, and a calculated rise, where I didn't fight back with words, but with actions that would eventually cost him everything. Disclaimer: this is a fictional story created for entertainment and motivational purposes only. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. The night my brother called me weak didn't begin like anything important. It was just another family dinner, the kind where everyone sits together out of habit more than love. The table was full plates of food, half-finished conversations, and the usual noise that comes from people pretending everything is normal. I sat in my usual place, quiet, listening more than speaking, watching everyone the way I always did. My brother Arman was in a loud mood that evening, telling stories about his latest achievement, exaggerating every detail to make himself sound bigger than he really was. Everyone laughed at his jokes, nodded at his words, and gave him the attention he had always been used to. I remember noticing how easily he controlled the room. It wasn't just confidence. It was something sharper, something that made people agree with him even when they didn't fully understand what he was saying. I had seen it my whole life. Our man didn't just speak, he performed. And I stayed in the background, comfortable in silence. Or at least that's what I told myself. At some point, the conversation shifted toward careers, success, and the future. It always did. Our parents started asking questions. What are you planning next? Where do you see yourself? How will you build something meaningful? Armin answered first, of course. He talked about expansion, big deals, and opportunities that sounded impressive but felt vague. Still, no one questioned him. They trusted his confidence more than they trusted facts. Then the attention slowly turned to me. It wasn't sudden, but I felt it. The slight pause in conversation. The expectation. My mother looked at me with a small, polite smile, waiting for an answer. My father leaned back, as if preparing to judge whatever I said next. I wasn't ready, not because I didn't have thoughts, but because I wasn't used to sharing them. Words felt heavier when people actually listened. I started speaking carefully, explaining my plans in a simple way. Learning, growing slowly, building something stable instead of rushing into risk. I didn't use big words or dramatic ideas. I just spoke honestly. That's when Armin laughed. It wasn't a soft laugh. It was sharp, sudden, and loud enough to cut through everything else. The kind of laugh that makes people stop eating, stop talking, stop thinking. It filled the room and left no space for anything else. He looked at me like I had just said something ridiculous. "You're weak," he said, still smiling like it was a joke. "You'll never survive in the real world." For a moment, I didn't fully understand what had happened. The words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been. I waited. Maybe someone would say something. Maybe someone would correct him. Maybe someone would laugh it off and move on. No one did. My mother lowered her eyes to her plate. My father didn't react at all. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable for them. It was normal. As if what Armand said wasn't wrong enough to challenge. That silence was louder than his words. I felt something shift inside me, but it wasn't anger, not yet. It was something colder. Something that spread slowly through my chest, tightening everything. I wanted to respond, to defend myself, to say something that would prove him wrong in that moment. But the words didn't come. Not because I didn't have them, but because I knew they wouldn't matter. Armin wasn't looking for a discussion. He had already decided who I was. And the worst part was, everyone else seemed to agree. I forced a small smile, the kind you use when you don't want anyone to see what's really happening inside you. I nodded slightly, as if I accepted what he said. It was easier that way. Easier than creating a scene. Easier than showing weakness in a different form. But inside, something was breaking. Every memory of being ignored, every moment of being overlooked, every time I stayed silent while others spoke over me. It all came rushing back at once. It wasn't just about that one sentence. It was about everything that led to it. I realized then that in their eyes, I had already lost. Not because I had failed, but because I had never tried to prove them wrong. That night, I stopped speaking entirely. I finished my meal in silence, listening to our man continue his stories as if nothing had happened. The conversation returned to normal. Laughter filled the room again, and the moment disappeared for everyone else. But not for me. When dinner ended, I went straight to my room. I closed the door quietly, not wanting to draw attention even then. The house felt different now, quieter, heavier, like it was holding on to something unspoken. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at nothing. The word replayed in my mind again and again. Weak. It sounded simple, almost harmless, but the way he said it, the way no one challenged it, turned it into something permanent. Something that defined me, at least in their eyes. I thought about confronting him later. Proving him wrong was arguments. Showing him that he didn't understand me. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't change anything. People like our man didn't listen to words. They believed in results, in power, in visible success. If I wanted to change how he saw me, I couldn't do it by talking. I had to become something he couldn't ignore. That realization didn't come with anger or revenge. Not yet. It came with clarity. A quiet understanding that the person I had been until that night would never be enough in their world. So I made a decision, right there in that silence. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't complain. I wouldn't try to prove myself in front of them. I would disappear from their expectations completely. And one day, without warning, I would return as someone they never saw coming. After that night, I didn't change in a way anyone could notice. That was the point. There were no dramatic moments, no confrontations, no visible signs that something inside me had shifted. From the outside, I remained the same quiet, reserved person everyone was used to. I still sat at the same place during dinner, still spoke only when necessary, and still avoided attention whenever possible. But internally, everything was different. I had stopped waiting for approval, stopped expecting anyone to understand me, and most importantly, stopped explaining myself. I began to observe more carefully. Not just people, but patterns, how decisions were made, how success was built, and how failure was hidden. Our man became my primary subject without him ever realizing it. I watched how he carried himself, how he spoke to others, how he handled pressure. At first glance, he seemed unstoppable. His confidence attracted people, his boldness impressed them, and his ability to take risks made him look powerful. But the more I paid attention, the more I noticed the details others ignored. He rushed decisions. He relied heavily on appearance. He cared more about looking successful than being stable. I didn't judge him. I studied him. At the same time, I started building my own path in complete silence. I didn't announce my goals or share my plans. I knew that anything I said would either be dismissed or compared to our man, and I had no interest in playing that game anymore. Instead, I focused on learning. I spent hours online, taking courses in business, finance, and digital skills that could be turned into income. I learned how markets worked, how investments grew, and how companies expanded or collapsed. It wasn't exciting at first. In fact, it was slow, repetitive, and often frustrating. But I stayed consistent. I took small freelance jobs, the kind most people would ignore. Writing, data entry, basic consulting, anything that allowed me to earn and learn at the same time. The money wasn't impressive, but that wasn't my goal. Every project taught me something new. Every client interaction sharpened my understanding, and every mistake made me more careful. I kept track of everything, my earnings, my expenses, my progress. Slowly, I began to see patterns, opportunities that others might overlook because they were too focused on quick success. Meanwhile, our man's life seemed to move in the opposite direction. His success grew rapidly, at least on the surface. He started a company that quickly gained attention. Social media posts showed him in expensive places, surrounded by influential people, celebrating deals and milestones. Our family admired him even more now. His name carried weight. His opinions mattered, and his presence commanded respect. Sometimes I would sit quietly and listen as our parents praised him, comparing his achievements to what they expected from me. It didn't hurt the same way anymore. The difference now was that I understood something they didn't. I could see the speed at which he was moving, and I knew that speed without control often leads to collapse. I didn't try to warn anyone. It wasn't my place, and even if it was, they wouldn't listen. Instead, I focused on strengthening myself. I built routines that no one saw. Early mornings spent learning while the house was quiet. Late nights analyzing data, improving strategies, and planning long-term moves. I avoided distractions, avoided unnecessary social interactions, and avoided anything that didn't contribute to growth. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was intentional. Over time, the results started to show, not publicly, but privately. My income became stable, then gradually increased. I reinvested most of it, making careful decisions instead of risky ones. I built connections quietly, reaching out to professionals, learning from them, offering value where I could. These weren't flashy relationships. There were no public announcements or visible partnerships, but they were real, and they were strong. The biggest change, however, was internal. I stopped seeing myself through the lens of others. The label of weak began to lose its meaning because I no longer measured strength the way Armand did. To him, strength was loud, fast, and visible. To me, it became something else entirely: discipline, patience, and control. There were moments when I questioned my approach. When I saw how quickly Armand was rising, it was easy to wonder if I was moving too slowly. If maybe he was right, and I lacked the boldness needed to succeed. But every time that doubt appeared, I returned to what I had learned. Fast growth without a foundation doesn't last. And I wasn't building for attention, I was building for stability. Years passed like this, quietly and steadily. To everyone else, I was still the same person, still underestimated, still overlooked. But that invisibility became my advantage. No one questioned what I was doing because no one thought it was worth noticing. Armand, on the other hand, became more visible with each passing year. His company expanded quickly, entering new markets and taking on bigger projects. He spoke with more authority, carried himself with even greater confidence, and seemed untouchable. But the more visible he became, the more exposed he was to risk. And that's when I began to see the cracks. Small at first. Easy to ignore if you weren't paying attention. Inconsistent decisions, sudden changes in direction, deals that didn't align with long-term stability. From the outside, everything still looked successful. But, from where I stood, the structure wasn't as strong as it appeared. I didn't act immediately. I wasn't ready yet, and more importantly, the timing wasn't right. I continued building, continued learning, and continued observing. Patience had become my greatest strength, and I wasn't going to abandon it for the sake of speed. By the time I finally looked at where I stood, I realized something unexpected. I was no longer trying to prove Armand wrong. That desire had faded somewhere along the way. What replaced it was something far more powerful: a clear understanding of who I had become and what I was capable of. I wasn't weak. I had simply chosen a different path, one that no one noticed. Until it was too late, the realization didn't come all at once. It built slowly, piece by piece, like a puzzle forming in the background, while everyone else was focused on the surface. By then, observing Armand had become second nature to me. I didn't need to follow him closely or ask questions. His life was public enough. His company updates, interviews, and appearances told a story, one that most people saw as success, but I had learned to read differently. It started with a small inconsistency. During one of his interviews, he spoke confidently about a major expansion plan. He mentioned new markets, partnerships, and projected growth numbers that sounded impressive. But something about it didn't align. The timeline was too aggressive, the scale too large for what his company had previously handled. To most people, it was ambition. To me, it was a risk that didn't match his foundation. I didn't jump to conclusions. Instead, I began digging deeper, using everything I had learned over the years. I followed the trail quietly: public records, financial disclosures, market behavior, and competitor responses. It wasn't easy, and it took time. But patterns started to emerge. The more I uncovered, the clearer the picture became. Armand's company wasn't growing the way it appeared. It was being held together by borrowed strength. He had taken multiple loans, far more than what would be considered safe for a business at his stage. These weren't strategic investments, they were lifelines. Each loan was used to cover another gap, to maintain the image of progress, while hiding the reality underneath. It was a cycle: expand, borrow, cover, repeat. At first, I thought it might be a temporary phase. Many businesses go through periods of instability before stabilizing. But this was different. The risk wasn't controlled. It was escalating. Then I found something even more concerning. Armand had entered into partnerships that didn't favor him. On paper, they looked like strong alliances, big names, promising collaborations, impressive announcements, but the terms told a different story. He had given away more control than he should have, trading long-term stability for short-term visibility. That's when it became clear. Armand wasn't building something strong. He was maintaining an illusion. The confidence he showed to the world wasn't backed by security, it was driven by pressure. The need to keep appearing successful had pushed him into decisions that made his position weaker over time. I remember sitting alone, reviewing everything I had gathered. It wasn't just information anymore, it was understanding. For the first time, I could see the full gap between how Armand was perceived and what he actually was. And in that moment, something shifted inside me. For years, I had been working quietly, focusing only on my own growth. I hadn't thought about confronting Armand or challenging him directly. My goal had been personal: to prove to myself that I wasn't what he called me. But now, the situation had changed. I wasn't just watching anymore. I had the knowledge, the resources, and the position to act. Still, I didn't rush. Acting too early would expose me, and exposure without complete control would only create resistance. I needed more than information, I needed leverage. So I continued building, but with a different focus. Instead of just growing my own work, I started positioning myself strategically within the same space Armand operated in. I expanded my network, connecting with people who were either directly or indirectly linked to his industry. Investors, clients, service providers. I approached them carefully, offering value without revealing my intentions. I didn't present myself as a competitor. I presented myself as an opportunity. That approach made all the difference. People were more open, more willing to engage, because they didn't see me as a threat. I learned what they needed, what they were dissatisfied with, and where Armand's company was failing to meet expectations. These weren't obvious weaknesses. They were subtle delays in delivery, inconsistent communication, unmet promises. Small issues that, over time, weakened trust. Trust, I had learned, is more valuable than growth. And Armand was losing it. As I gathered more insights, I began shaping a plan, not to expose him publicly. That would be too direct and too messy. I wasn't interested in destroying him in a single moment. That kind of impact is temporary. I wanted something deeper. I wanted to dismantle the structure he had built, piece by piece, until there was nothing left holding it together. But to do that, I needed to remain invisible. That's when I made one of the most important decisions of my journey. I would not operate under my own name. Instead, I created a separate identity, a professional presence that had no connection to my past. It wasn't fake, but it was detached. This allowed me to move freely within the same space without being recognized or associated with Armand. Through this identity, I began establishing my company. Unlike Armand's approach, I focused on fundamentals: strong systems, clear communication, reliable delivery. I didn't promise more than I could handle, and I didn't chase rapid expansion. Every step was measured, every decision calculated. At first, the progress was slow. Building credibility takes time, especially when you're not relying on attention or hype. But I stayed consistent. And slowly, the results started to come. Clients who had worked with our man began noticing the difference. Not because I targeted them directly, but because they were already looking for alternatives. When they found me, they stayed. Investors who were unsure about his direction became interested in my stability. They saw potential not in speed, but in structure. The shift was invisible yet, but it had begun. Our man continued moving forward as if nothing had changed. His public image remained strong, his confidence unchanged. But beneath that, the foundation was weakening, and he didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did, but didn't know how to stop. I watched as the gap between perception and reality grew wider. Each new decision he made added pressure instead of reducing it. Each expansion stretched his resources further. Each partnership tied him into obligations he couldn't fully control. And all the while, I was positioning myself to be the alternative, not loudly, not publicly, but effectively. This wasn't about revenge anymore, at least not in the way most people understand it. It wasn't driven by anger or emotion. It had become something more precise. A calculated response to years of being overlooked. A strategy built on patience, observation, and timing. And for the first time, I knew something with complete certainty. Armin's downfall wouldn't come from a single mistake. It would come from everything he had built on a foundation that was never strong enough to hold it. By the time everything was in place, the shift had already begun. Even if no one could see it clearly yet. The market our man once controlled so confidently was no longer stable beneath him. It wasn't a sudden collapse or a dramatic failure. It was slower than that, more precise, like pressure building quietly until the structure could no longer hold. And the most important part was that none of it could be traced back to me. I didn't attack directly. That would have been reckless, the kind of move Armand himself would make. Instead, I focused on influence. Every decision I made was designed to redirect value clients, partnerships, opportunities away from him and toward me, without raising suspicion. It required patience and control, two things I had spent years mastering. The first step was understanding his strongest assets. Not what he showed publicly, but what actually kept his company functioning. Certain clients brought consistent revenue. Certain partnerships gave him credibility. Certain suppliers ensured his operations didn't break under pressure. These were the pillars holding everything together. So I began there. Through my separate identity, I approached those same clients, not as a competitor, but as a better option. I didn't criticize Armand or point out his weaknesses. That would have made people defensive. Instead, I offered clarity where he had created confusion. I provided stability where he had delivered inconsistency. My proposals were simple, transparent, and reliable. At first, the response was cautious. Loyalty, even in business, doesn't disappear overnight. But loyalty weakens when trust is already damaged. And Armand had been weakening that trust for a long time without realizing it. One client shifted, then another. Small at first, almost insignificant when viewed individually. But I wasn't looking at individual moves. I was watching the pattern. Each shift reduced his stability just enough to increase pressure elsewhere. At the same time, I strengthened my own position. I ensured that every new client received exactly what was promised. No delays, no excuses, no unnecessary risks. Consistency became my strategy. While Armand continued chasing growth, I focused on control. The next phase involved his partnerships. Armand had built relationships that looked powerful on the surface, but many of them were based on expectations he could no longer meet. Deadlines slipped, projections changed, and communication became less reliable. These weren't failures big enough to cause immediate collapse, but they created doubt. I didn't create that doubt. I used it. Through carefully placed conversations and strategic proposals, I positioned myself as a solution to problems they were already experiencing. I didn't try to replace our man immediately. That would have raised questions. Instead, I integrated slowly, offering support services, secondary roles, and collaborative opportunities. Once inside, I made my value clear. Where Armand struggled to maintain consistency, I delivered it without fail. Where he overpromised, I stayed within limits and exceeded expectations quietly. Over time, the comparison became unavoidable, even if no one said it out loud. One by one, those partnerships began to shift their priorities. Our man was still involved, but no longer central, and that was enough. The most critical part of the plan, however, was timing. It wasn't enough to weaken his position gradually. There needed to be a moment, a point where everything aligned, where the pressure he had built over time reached its peak. That moment came when his financial situation tightened beyond recovery. The loans he had taken earlier began to demand returns. Payments that were manageable before became heavier as his revenue streams weakened. The expansion that once made him look powerful now became a burden he couldn't sustain. I had anticipated this. Through my connections, I was aware of the increasing pressure from his lenders. I knew he was searching for a solution, something big enough to stabilize everything at once. That's when I prepared the final step. Using my separate identity, I presented an opportunity. It was structured as a major deal, one that promised immediate relief and long-term stability. The kind of offer that would attract someone in his position. It wasn't unrealistic, but it required commitment. It required trust. And most importantly, it required him to rely on someone he didn't fully understand. Armand didn't accept immediately. I expected that. Despite everything, he wasn't careless when it came to decisions of this scale. He reviewed the proposal, asked questions, negotiated terms. From the outside, it looked like a standard business process. But I knew what was happening beneath the surface. He was running out of options. Every delay increased his pressure. Every failed alternative made my offer more appealing. I didn't push. I didn't follow up aggressively. I let the situation guide him toward the decision. Because when someone feels cornered, they don't choose the best option. They choose the only option they believe they have. Eventually, he agreed. The deal was signed under conditions that gave me exactly what I needed. Control over key aspects of his operations. Not complete ownership. Not yet. But enough influence to determine the direction of what remained. From that point forward, the outcome was no longer uncertain. I didn't need to make any dramatic moves. The structure he had built was already unstable. All I had to do was remove the final supports. Operational decisions were adjusted. Financial flows were redirected. Priorities were shifted in ways that appeared logical on the surface, but gradually reduced his ability to recover. Nothing I did was reckless or illegal. Every step was justified within the terms he had agreed to, and yet the effect was undeniable. His company began to shrink. Not suddenly, not publicly, but internally. Projects slowed down. Resources became limited. Confidence within his team started to fade. The same people who once believed in his vision began to question it. Our man tried to respond. He pushed harder, made faster decisions, took bigger risks. But by then, those actions only made things worse. Without realizing it, he was accelerating the collapse he was trying to prevent. I watched all of this without interference. Not because I enjoyed it, but because intervention would have disrupted the process. This wasn't about a single victory. It was about completion. Everything he had built, every decision he had made, every risk he had taken, it all led to this point. And the final step was already in motion. He just didn't know who had set it in place. By the time the meeting was scheduled, there was nothing left to guess. The outcome had already taken shape long before we sat across from each other. Still, that moment carried a different kind of weight. Not because I was unsure, but because everything that had been built in silence was about to be seen for the first time. The office was quiet, designed to feel neutral, almost detached from the tension it was about to hold. I arrived early, not out of nervousness, but out of habit. Preparation had become part of how I operated. Every detail of the meeting had been planned, the structure of the conversation, the documents that would be presented, the sequence in which everything would unfold. There was no room for improvisation. When Armand walked in, the difference between who he was and who he had been was immediately visible. The confidence was still there, but it no longer felt natural. It looked forced, like something he was holding on to out of necessity rather than belief. His posture carried tension, his movement slightly slower, his focus sharper but more restless. He wasn't the same person who once controlled every room he entered without effort. At first, he didn't recognize me. That moment, brief as it was, revealed more than anything else. It showed how completely I had removed myself from the version of me he remembered. To him, I had remained the same person, quiet, unimportant, predictable. He had never considered the possibility that I could exist outside that image. I greeted him professionally, keeping the interaction consistent with the identity I had maintained throughout the process. There was no hesitation, no sign of familiarity in my tone. To him, I was just another figure involved in the deal, someone with authority, but no personal connection. We began with the formalities. The discussion started with numbers, projections, and operational details. Everything was presented clearly, with no exaggeration and no unnecessary complexity. I walked him through the current state of his company as it appeared within the framework of the deal. The data spoke for itself: declining revenue streams, increased financial pressure, reduced operational flexibility. None of it was new to him, but seeing it structured in front of him made it impossible to ignore. He responded the way I expected. He questioned certain points, challenged specific conclusions, and attempted to reposition the situation in a more favorable light. It wasn't denial, it was instinct. The same instinct that had driven him to maintain control for so long. But the difference now was that control had limits. I didn't argue, I didn't push back emotionally. Every response I gave was grounded in facts, supported by evidence, and delivered without urgency. There was no need to convince him. The reality was already there. As the conversation progressed, I began introducing the deeper layers of the deal. The parts that defined not just the current situation, but the direction everything would take moving forward. Ownership structures, decision-making authority, financial oversight, each element carefully designed to shift control without appearing aggressive. That's when he started paying closer attention. There was a moment, subtle but clear, where his focus changed. It wasn't about the deal anymore. It was about me. Something in the way I spoke, the way I structured my points, the way I anticipated his questions. It triggered recognition. He looked at me differently, not as a business associate, but as someone he was trying to place in his memory. I didn't react. I continued as planned, allowing that realization to develop on its own. It was important that it came from him, not from anything I said. The turning point came when I presented the final set of documents. These weren't just projections or summaries. They were a complete map of how his company had reached this point: every major decision, every financial move, every structural weakness. It wasn't framed as an attack. It was framed as analysis. But the depth of it made one thing clear. This wasn't external observation. This was understanding. He stopped speaking for a moment, scanning through the pages more carefully now. The room grew quieter, the kind of silence that isn't empty but filled with realization. When he finally looked up again, there was no confusion left in his expression. "You," he said, his voice lower, more controlled. It wasn't a question in the usual sense, it was recognition. For the first time, he wasn't seeing the identity I had created. He was seeing me. I held his gaze without changing my expression. There was no satisfaction in that moment, no visible reaction. Everything that needed to be said had already been built into the process that led us there. "Yes," I replied simply. The shift in him was immediate, but not explosive. There was no anger, no raised voice, no dramatic reaction. Instead, there was something more: restrained, an attempt to understand how everything had unfolded without his awareness. He leaned back slightly, as if creating distance. Not from me physically, but from the situation itself. His mind was working through the timeline, connecting pieces that had never seemed related before. I didn't interrupt. After a moment, he spoke again, this time more directly. "How long?" The question carried more weight than the words suggested. He wasn't asking about the deal. He was asking about everything. How long I had been building, observing, positioning myself within his world without being noticed. "Long enough," I said. It wasn't meant to be vague. It was meant to be precise in a different way. The exact timeline didn't matter. What mattered was the consistency behind it. He looked back down at the documents, then back at me. There was something different in his expression now. Not respect, not yet, but recognition of capability. "You planned this," he said. Again, not a question. Yes. There was no reason to deny it. The structure of everything made that clear. The conversation that followed wasn't about denial or resistance. It was about acceptance, though not immediate or complete. He asked fewer questions, but the ones he asked were more focused. Not on whether the situation could be changed, but on how it had been allowed to develop to this point. I answered only what was necessary. There was no need to explain motivations or revisit the past. This wasn't a personal confrontation in the way he might have expected. It was the conclusion of a process. Eventually, the discussion returned to the deal itself. The terms hadn't changed. The structure remained the same. The only difference now was awareness. He knew who was sitting across from him. And he knew that every option he had left existed within the framework I had created, which meant that whatever decision he made next was no longer entirely his own. The collapse didn't arrive with noise or spectacle. There were no headlines, no dramatic announcements, no single moment where everything visibly fell apart. Instead, it unfolded the same way it had been set in motion. Quietly, gradually, and with a precision that left little room for resistance. By the time others began to notice, the outcome had already been decided. Our man's company didn't disappear overnight. It tightened, reduced, and restructured itself under pressure. Projects that once defined its growth were scaled back or canceled entirely. Teams became smaller, resources more limited, and decisions more cautious. From the outside, it looked like a business going through a difficult phase, but internally, the reality was more final. The system he had built could no longer sustain itself. He tried to adapt. That part of him hadn't changed. He continued to push for solutions, searching for ways to regain control, to rebuild what had been lost. But every path led back to the same constraint, the structure of the deal, the obligations tied to it, and the limits those obligations imposed. The flexibility he once relied on was gone. For the first time, he was operating within boundaries he hadn't set. The people around him began to respond differently as well. Those who once followed his lead without hesitation started to question his decisions. It wasn't open defiance, not at first. It was hesitation, uncertainty, a shift in tone during conversations. Trust, once weakened, had now become fragile. And without trust, leadership loses its foundation. Some of his closest associates distanced themselves quietly. Others stayed, but with reduced confidence. The same presence that once commanded respect now required explanation. And explanation, repeated often enough, becomes doubt. I didn't interfere during this phase. There was nothing left to direct. The process had moved beyond strategy and into consequence. Everything that was happening was a natural extension of what had already been set in place. Our interactions became less frequent, but not entirely absent. There were moments where communication was necessary: updates, decisions, formal discussions tied to the remaining structure of the business. Each interaction was controlled, focused, and limited to what was required. There was no return to familiarity, no attempt to rebuild a personal connection. But there was change. Not in the situation, but in him. The confidence that once defined him had shifted into something more measured. He spoke less, listened more, and approached decisions with a level of caution that hadn't existed before. It wasn't weakness. It was awareness and understanding of limits that he had never acknowledged when things were going in his favor. One conversation stood out. It wasn't scheduled as anything significant. Just a routine meeting to review the remaining operations. The kind of discussion that, in another context, would have been purely technical. But something in the way he approached it was different. He didn't start with numbers or strategy. He looked at me for a moment, as if deciding whether to say something that went beyond the usual boundaries. Then he spoke. Not with the authority he once carried, but with a clarity that came from everything he had experienced. "I didn't see it," he said. There was no need to ask what he meant. He wasn't talking about a single decision or a specific mistake. He was referring to the entire process, the way everything had developed without his awareness, the way his own actions had contributed to the outcome. I didn't respond immediately, not because I didn't have an answer, but because the moment didn't require one. He continued, more quietly this time. I thought being ahead meant being strong. It was the closest he had come to acknowledging the difference between perception and reality. The same difference I had spent years understanding. Being ahead doesn't always mean being stable, I said. The response was simple, but it carried everything that needed to be said. He nodded slightly, not in agreement alone, but in recognition. For the first time, there was no resistance in him, no attempt to defend what had already been lost, just acceptance. That acceptance didn't change the outcome. The company, as it once existed, was gone. What remained was a reduced version, controlled, limited, and no longer driven by his original vision. His reputation had shifted as well. Not destroyed entirely, but altered. People remembered the success, but they also remembered the fall. And in business, both become part of the same story. For me, the end didn't feel like a victory. There was no sense of completion in the way I had once imagined. No satisfaction in seeing him lose what he had built. If anything, the final stage revealed something I hadn't fully considered before. Revenge, when carried out completely, doesn't create the feeling people expect. It doesn't fill anything, it simply ends something. The motivation that had driven me for so long had already faded before this moment. What remained was the result, not the purpose. I looked at everything I had built, everything I had achieved, and realized that none of it depended on his downfall anymore. It had become separate, independent, capable of existing without the need for comparison. That was the real shift. Not his loss, but my detachment from it. We finished the meeting without extending the conversation further. There was nothing left to resolve beyond what had already been structured. As he stood to leave, there was a brief pause, the kind that suggests something could be said, but isn't. He didn't apologize. I didn't expect him to. Some things don't require words, especially when the consequences have already been lived through. He walked out without looking back, and I remained where I was, not because I needed to stay, but because I understood something clearly in that moment. The word that had once defined me no longer held any meaning, because the person it was meant for no longer existed. This wasn't just a story about revenge, it was a story about transformation. Sometimes, the people who doubt you the most unknowingly push you toward your greatest strength, but in the end, it's not about proving them wrong, it's about proving to yourself that you were never what they said you were. If this story taught you anything, let it be this. Real power is built in silence. Patience is stronger than pride. And the best comeback doesn't make noise. It changes everything.